Okay, we're going to go a little farther with our discussion of triads and learn a little bit of new terminology. Let me start by turning to example D4 in your textbooks. Example D4 shows the different triads that you can get in the key of C major. Again, this is with the white notes or natural notes on the piano. CEG is a major triad, so is FAC, GBD. The minor triads are DFA, EGB, ACE, and the one triad that is different is the diminished triad, BDF. We use the same names that we use for scale degrees, tonic, supertonic, mediant, etc., to refer to the chords that are built on those scale degrees. So we can refer to the tonic chord, the mediant chord, the dominant chord, the leading tone chord. It turns out that because major scales are all the same with the same intervals in them, the triads in every major scale have the same quality. That is, the tonic triad is always major, the supertonic triad is always minor, the leading tone triad is always diminished. So if we were in a different key, like the key of D major, the tonic triad would be D, F sharp, A. It would be major. The leading tone triad would be C sharp, E, G, and it would be diminished. So you can always count on the triads having the same quality in every major key. The triad's qualities are different in minor keys because minor is a different scale with different intervals in it. Here are the triads that we have in the key of C, and specifically, most of these chords use the harmonic form of the minor scale. So the tonic chord is minor, the supertonic chord is diminished, the mediant and the dominant and the submediant chord are all major, the subdominant chord is minor, and again, the leading tone triad is diminished. Notice that the dominant chord and the leading tone chord do use that harmonic form of the minor scale with a B natural instead of a B flat. But don't use the harmonic form of minor for the mediant chord, because in that case you would have an augmented triad, which is kind of a weird sound. Most composers choose to stay away from the sound of the augmented triad, and that's why for this chord the quality should be a major chord using the notes of the natural minor scale. So far we've been looking at chords in such a way that the bottom note of the chord is the root of the chord, and I showed you that we could have the root of the chord, the third of the chord, and the fifth of the chord, reading from bottom to top. But what happens if we put a note at the bottom of a chord that's not the root, and we then stack the notes above that? Well, it turns out that the root of this chord is still G, because the only way that we can stack the chord up in thirds is by putting a G on the bottom. Here the chord isn't stacked in thirds. The G, which is the root, has been moved to the top of the chord. We would say that these two chords are chords that are in inversion. Just as with the inversion of intervals, you take an interval and you turn it upside down, here we're doing the same thing. We're taking the fifth from G to D and we're inverting it into a fourth. Same thing here. The D is below the G, so we have an inversion of that interval and an inversion of the chord. The chord that has the third on the bottom is said to be in first inversion, and the chord that has the fifth on the bottom is said to be in second inversion. The chord that has the root on the bottom is said to be in root position. Do not get confused between the terms root and bass. We're going to use the word bass in this class to refer to the lowest pitched note in a chord. The bass note of this chord is G, the bass note of this chord is B, and the bass note of this chord is D. But the root is that member of a tertian chord, which is on the bottom of a stack of thirds. Okay, so when we take the notes of G major, G, B, D, and we stack them up so that we have a stack of thirds, not a stack that includes a fourth like we do here, but a stack that includes only thirds, the bottom note of that stack is the root of the chord. When a chord is in root position, the root and the bass are the same note. When a chord is in inversion, the bass note is not the root, and the root is not the bass note. Chord inversion is relatively easy to figure out when the notes are written close to each other on a single staff like this. But as we go on in this class, you're also going to be seeing chords that are spread out on the grand staff with some notes in treble clef and some notes in bass clef. But the process of identifying the inversion of the chord is the same here. We know that these are all G major triads, or I'll tell you that they're all G major triads. And the notes are G, B, and D. G is the root, B is the third, D is the fifth. This chord has B as its lowest note, meaning that it's in first inversion. Don't be confused and look at the notes in treble clef and say that the D is the lowest note. The D might be the lowest note in treble clef, but the lowest note of the whole chord is the B that's here in bass clef. So this is a first inversion G major triad. Here the G is the bass note, so the root of the chord is the bass, and this is a root position G major triad. And then just to finish things off, this chord has a D in the bass, and we have a second inversion G major triad. Next, we're going to talk about a system for showing the different inversions of triads, which is a little bit less cumbersome than having to write out first inversion, second inversion. So I'm going to introduce you to figured bass. Figured bass is a kind of a shorthand that was used in the Baroque era for composers to show what harmonies they meant to be played along with a bass line. Here's an exercise from a little bit farther on in your book. It's really just the next chapter, I believe. But it shows you a little bit of what figured bass looked like. You can see here that we've got bass notes, and underneath the bass notes we have these little symbols which consist of numbers or accidentals or combinations of numbers and accidentals. And so that would tell the keyboard player to play this note in the bass, and then according to the instructions in the figured bass, it would tell you what notes to play in your right hand to complete the rest of the chord. So we're not going to learn everything about figured bass in this video or in this chapter of the book, but we'll at least get started with it. Figured bass is a way of showing chords in terms of intervals above the bass, not intervals above the root, intervals above the bass. So when you have a root position triad, this could be written with a bass note and then underneath the bass note, the figures 5, 3. Notice that in figured bass, the big numbers are always on top and the littler numbers are down below. And that's because if we wrote this chord in the most compact version with the notes as close as possible to the D, the third of the chord, or the note a third above the root, would be right above the D, and the fifth would then be a little bit higher than that. So the 5 goes above the 3. If we write the chord with the third in the bass so that it's in first inversion, and if we wanted to show that with figured bass, we would say, okay, here's the F sharp. It's the third of the chord, which means that above it we're going to have a note that's a third higher, and we're going to have a note that's a sixth higher. So that would be a 6-3. And if we write the chord with the A on the bottom, and above that the D and the F sharp, then to show that in figured bass, we would show the A, and we'd say, okay, above the A, you should play a note that's a fourth above, and you should play a note that's a sixth above. So 5-3 indicates root position, 6-3 indicates first inversion, and 6-4 indicates second inversion. In practice, we often won't use the complete figure. The abbreviation for 5-3 is to write nothing at all. So a D with no figure underneath it, just a blank space, that would indicate a root position triad. When you have a first inversion triad, you don't need to write the 3 because the 3 is assumed. Just like we assume with no figures that it's a 5-3, we can still assume that there's a third above this, and we can just write a 6 to indicate first inversion. But if we want a second inversion chord, we have to write both numbers of the figured bass. We would say the A is the bass note, and above that we want not a third but a fourth, and not a fifth but a sixth. So the 5-3 can sometimes be invisible. If there's no figure shown, it's root position. 6-3 underneath the note means the same thing as just 6. It means that the 3 is invisible here, but it still is a first inversion triad. The bass note is the third of the chord, and when you see a 6 and a 4, you know it's a second inversion chord, and the bass note is the fifth of the chord. My final lecture on Chapter D will take up seventh chords, and that will be lecture 3.